Thanks. Joining me now is UN Watch Executive Director Hillel Neuer. Hillel, thanks very much for being here. What is your reaction to this new development? We're waiting on more details, in fact, if this deal goes through, the ceasefire.
Look, it's the Middle East, it's the bazaar, and Hamas wants to show its base that they're fighting until the very last moment. I think we can expect, given the deadline that President Trump has put, I think we can expect that Hamas, in the end, will go ahead with the deal. This is sort of last-minute bargaining.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned President Trump, because the president-elect posted this on Truth Social. This epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November. My national security team, through the efforts of Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, will continue to work closely with Israel and our allies to make sure Gaza never becomes a terrorist safe haven. The Times of Israel is reporting that Arab officials say Witkoff swayed Netanyahu more in one meeting than Biden did all year. But incoming White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt writes this on X. Let's be clear. This deal would not have been struck without the forceful hand of President Trump and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff. Once again, peace through strength prevails. Even Biden's State Department praised the Trump team for the efforts, although Joe Biden himself, he was reluctant to do so. Watch this.
This ceasefire agreement was a long time in the making and comes as a result of extensive diplomatic engagements by President Biden, Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Director of Central Intelligence William Burns, Brett McGurk, and other officials across the government, as well as our partners in the governments of Qatar and Egypt. When it comes to the involvement of President-elect Trump's team, it has been absolutely critical in getting this deal over the line.
Who's the history books credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you.
Is that a joke? He said. Hillel, how much did Trump and his team sway the negotiations? I know Joe Biden has been asking for a ceasefire for a year, but what do you think? How did this happen now?
Look, I think both administrations, the outgoing and the incoming, get credit. The details were indeed developed over many months. The pressure, the urgency is the incoming administration. So I think the Biden team can get credit for working on the details, but the urgency that President Trump put in his announcement that all hell would break loose if the deal was not done by next week, and him sending his special envoy to the region, putting pressure on everyone, I think that urgency is what clinched the deal. And I think this deal needs to be welcomed with a mix of relief, heartache, and outrage. Relief that finally, after 466 days, some hostages will begin to be released in the next few weeks. We're expecting 33 hostages so far. That's the relief. The heartache is knowing that dozens have been killed and died in the past year plus in the torture chambers of Hamas in Gaza. The idea that many of the hostages will not be released in the initial phase, and the opening up of the wound of what they suffered, the torture, the horrific abuse. And finally, the outrage at what Hamas did on October 7th, the massacre of entire families, horrific, unspeakable atrocities, and the support that Hamas won in campuses and other quarters of the elites across America and around the world.
Yeah, I mean, President Biden says, thanks to him, terrorism threats in Gaza have been significantly diminished. Watch this.
Now, the terror network that once protected and sustained Hamas is far weaker. Iran is weaker. Iran is weaker than it's been in decades. Hezbollah is badly degraded. And after more than 15 months of war, Hamas's senior leaders are dead. Thousands of Hamas fighters are dead. And the military formations have been destroyed.
So many questions about that, Hillel. First of all, I don't think Iran is weakened. I mean, they've had an opportunity to generate billions and billions of oil revenue, sell it to China. This administration, the Biden administration, blew off the sanctions. And I want to get your take on this deal as well, because who's in charge of Gaza now? What's next for the region? And why is it that so many of the hostages, 33 hostages will be released in the first phase, dozens alive and dead, will remain in Gaza? It just seems the initial phases of this deal is, one Israeli for 50 Palestinians in one frame, and one Israeli for 30 Palestinians. What do you make of this deal?
Look, Hamas leaders have been declaring victory in the past day. Their deputy chief, Hillel Neuer, said this was a victory that would be a source of pride for generations. And he said it was a turning point in history for the Palestinians. And this is absurd. Indeed, it is true. Whether Biden can claim credit for it or not, because at various key points, he told Israel to hold back, whether it was the war in Lebanon, whether it was entering Rafah. Of course, he did supply arms to Israel for the most part, but there's no question Hezbollah has been crushed. That forced Lebanon to demand a ceasefire and has a new leadership. Syria, the Assad regime, as a result of Iran and Hezbollah being weakened, Assad regime fell and is no more. Iran is weakened. Their air defenses, you're right about what you said about oil. That is an outrage. But their air defenses were, significantly destroyed, and They are vulnerable. So there is no victory. And we should note that never before in history has a side claimed to suffer genocide at the same time that they declare victory in the war and massacre that they started.
Yeah, I mean, Iran may be weakened as a result of Israel's aggressiveness, despite Biden's guidance. I mean, Biden kept telling them, end this, ceasefire now, don't go into Rafah. Israel blew that off and did it. And yes, there was a weakening of Iranian leadership and proxies as a result of that. Hillel, we're watching this closely, and we want to see whether or not this actually sticks. Thank you, sir.